Today's story comes out of China, and it is a brutal story. There's just no way to tell it without being sort of graphic. So with that in mind, this is definitely a mature audiences only type of story. That said, it is a fascinating story, and the ending is something that very few of you are going to see coming. It's going to feel kind of predictable throughout most of the story, and then it's like the end completely changes your impression of the story. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to power wash the like button's house, but be sure you set the machine all the way up so you blow off their shingles and blast all their paint off, and then you just leave. Just leave it as is. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. One Saturday afternoon in November of 1990, a 26-year-old kindergarten teacher named Su Lixia sat crying on a bench at a train station in the city of Naha, which is located in northeastern China. Su had just left her husband for good. They'd had a bad marriage for a long time. It was very contentious. They fought all the time. And that morning, they had gotten into this major fight. And for Su, it was kind of like the final straw. And so she just stormed into the bedroom, grabbed some things, threw it in a bag, and just stormed out. She was done. But Su really didn't have a plan for what she was going to do once she left the house. And so she found herself just sitting at this train station doing nothing, just staring at the trains rolling in and out over and over again. And as she sat there, again, not knowing what she's going to do, she suddenly took stock of the fact that very few people were getting on and off of these trains. And in fact, the train station itself was weirdly vacant. So the city of Naha, where Su was actually fairly small by China's standards, even though there was 70,000 people that lived there. The city sat at the base of this towering mountain, and then all around the city in the outskirts was basically just farmland with lots of soy and corn crops. And then as you move closer to the city center, there were lots of things you would expect to see in a city, like tall buildings and, residential and commercial areas. But overall, Naha was just kind of boring. It's like the city was a city, even if it was small, but there was just not much going on. And in fact, if you lived in China, but not in Naha, there was a very good chance you didn't know Naha even existed, like it was kind of irrelevant. However, in the last few months leading up to this moment that Su is sitting at this train station, the city of Naha had suddenly been put on the map, and everybody knew about this city, because women from Naha were going missing in droves. In fact, Su herself knew of at least a dozen women who had gone missing over the past few months from Naha. And as these women started going missing, it was making the news all over the country, and women who lived in Naha were acutely aware of the risks of being out alone, in fear that somebody was going to come snatch them up and take them away. In fact, every time Su would go to work, she would make sure she would walk with other women, like in pairs, to ensure safety. I mean, this was a really scary time if you were a woman living in Naha. However, the caveat to the missing women was all of them to this point, when Su was sitting at the train station, had been sex workers. And Su, she thought, in virtue of not being a sex worker and instead being a kindergarten teacher, that somehow she was not actually that vulnerable to being snatched up or, whatever was happening to these women, she just felt like it wouldn't happen to her. But now, as Su sat at this train station, which again was eerily quiet and vacant, she couldn't help but feel like she had made a bad decision being here. She felt like she could easily become the next woman who went missing from Naha. And so Su began to think, maybe I should just go back home and try to patch things up with my husband, mostly for her safety, just to go back inside her home and be safe again. But before she could stand up to do that, she noticed on the other end of the platform this man who was exceptionally well dressed with this beautiful brown wool coat and fancy pants. He looked like he stepped straight out of a fashion magazine. He came up onto the train platform, and without saying a word, he walked slowly down the platform all the way to where Su was, and he reached into his pocket and he held out a tissue to her because he saw she was crying. And Su, she's looking up at the sky, and again, there's nobody else here, and she's very much on edge. And she doesn't know what to do. I mean, it was already creepy that this place was vacant, but it's even stranger to have a random man come up to her and try to initiate some sort of interaction with her. It just felt wrong and weird and very suspicious. But as Su stared at the sky, trying to figure out what his angle was, she could see that he had kind of kept himself standing back from her, kind of a respectful distance, not trying to crowd her out. And he was looking at her with a very sympathetic look on his face, and he's holding this tissue out, and he said to her, "Are you okay?" And he hands the tissue again, like, "Please take it." And there was just something about this guy that felt very sincere, and Sue kind of let her guard down, and she accepted the tissue and wiped the tears from her eyes. She didn't say anything, and then this guy, he said, "Hey, do you mind if I sit with you?" And at this point, Sue said, "Yeah, okay, you can sit down." And so this very handsome, well-dressed man took a seat next to Sue, not right next to her, again, respectful distance from her. And again, he asked her, "Hey, are you doing okay?" And for Sue, whose life had been basically miserable the last few months or even years with this terrible marriage she was in, she wasn't used to being asked if she was okay. And this man, who she didn't know, had caught her at this very vulnerable moment in her life. And it was like all her emotions just came pouring out. And she began sobbing hysterically, telling this guy that no, she was not okay. Her life was in ruins. She had just abandoned her family and she had no idea what she was going to do. And finally, when Sue stopped telling this guy all about her problems, she felt very embarrassed and kind of looked up at him like she was sorry for even saying as much. But the man, who was very intently listening, he was just nodding along, very sympathetic, and he told Sue that his name was Jia Wang, and that he was a director at a factory not far from here, and if she was open to it, he'd be happy to think about hiring her at the factory, give her a new start potentially, because it seemed like that's what she really needed. And then he asked her if she wanted to come back to his house to discuss this job opportunity further. Now with this, even though Sue had really appreciated everything this guy had done to this point, the second he asked her to come back to his house, she's like, red flags are going up. She knew there's something off here. Clearly this guy does have an angle, and it's not to benefit me. And so she looked at him with an absolutely suspicious look, like, "No way am I going to your house. I don't know you. Like, I appreciate the tissue and you letting me cry, but there's no way." But again, as she's staring at him with the suspicious look, the look on Gia's face remained very sympathetic and very gentle, and it almost seemed like he was just going to get up and go, like, "Hey, I'm sorry for offending you." But before he did get up to leave, Sue said, "Hold on. Actually, yes, I'll come with you." She didn't know why she agreed to go with him. Maybe it was because her life was so messed up at this point that she was just kind of ready to take chances and be sort of reckless, and this was definitely that. Big chance, very reckless. But again, she just felt like, there's something sincere about this guy, and she felt like she could trust him. And so Sue and Gia stood up, and together they walked down the train platform, not saying much. They went downstairs, they went out to the street, and they walked a couple of blocks to where Gia's street was. And as soon as they turned the corner and he showed Sue which house was his, Sue looked up, and whatever hesitations she had had still to that point about following the stranger to his house were gone, because she saw his house was beautiful. It wasn't that it was so grand or anything, it totally fit with the neighborhood, but it was very well maintained and totally felt on brand for a guy who was so well dressed and so well manicured and frankly so handsome. So Gia led the way to the front door of his house. He unlocked the door, he opened it up, and then he gently gestured for Sue to come on inside. And so she did. She walked past him, Gia followed her in, and the two of them took off their shoes and made their way into the kitchen, where Gia brewed some tea for them, and then they both sat down and began to sip their tea and talk about this job opportunity. And so for a few minutes, Gia is telling Sue all about the role and what she might be doing. And Sue is kind of asking general questions about it. But, for the most part, she just kind of enjoyed being in the presence of somebody who seemed to care about her. But after she finished her entire glass of tea, suddenly Gia, who had been talking this whole time about the factory, just stopped. It was like he was waiting for her to drink that entire drink. And as soon as she was done with her cup, Gia, again, he went quiet and just stared at Sue with this kind of sinister look on his face, like he was very pleased with what was going on. And at that point, Sue looked down at her teacup and then back at Gia, and suddenly she began to feel very drowsy. It was like her vision was beginning to go, and she realized Gia clearly had poisoned her. There was something inside of her tea. And so before she could do anything, everything went black. A couple of weeks later, just a few blocks away from where Sue met Gia at the train station, a police officer named Zhang was standing behind his desk at the police station when a very concerned-looking elderly couple came inside. Now, this couple was here to speak with Zhang about a missing person, but the missing person was not Sue. She had been missing for 2 weeks now, nobody had seen her, but no one had reported her missing. Her husband had just assumed that Sue had left him, and that's why he hadn't seen her, and so he had naturally not reported that. And again, nobody else knew she was missing, so keep that in mind. Officer Zhang has no idea about Sue and Gia, none of it. But when this elderly couple came in to make a missing person report, Officer Zhang was not the least bit surprised. It was now December of 1990, and over the past 6 months, 20 women out of Naha had suddenly gone missing. Remember, Sue is not one of those 20. The 20 are mostly sex workers who went missing at that same train station where Sue met Jia. And so Officer Zhang was used to making all these missing person reports. But candidly, the police actually felt like, because these were sex workers that were going missing, they weren't sure if they were actually being abducted or if they were simply getting on a train and kind of leaving town to go work somewhere else. And so really there wasn't a whole lot of investigation happening to figure out why so many of these women were going missing. But again, Officer Zhang, he's not surprised that they're telling him they want to file a missing person report. But when Zhang took this elderly couple to an interview room to talk to them about whoever was missing in their lives, when this couple spoke, Officer Zhang knew this was different, because the couple was not reporting another missing woman from Naha who also happened to be a sex worker. Instead, they were reporting that a man was missing, a businessman. However, the details of his disappearance sounded eerily similar to all these sex-working women who had also gone missing. This guy was last seen at that same train station where Sue had met Jia, and then nobody had seen him, and so that's why they were here. And so Officer Zhang, he wrote up their report, and then he told the couple that, very likely this man is okay, and he'll show up at some point under his own steam, but he told them the police would look into it, and they'd be in touch. However, as this couple got up and turned around and left, Officer Zhang couldn't help but feel like this missing man and all these missing women went missing from the same place, and it's the same city and it's the same pattern over and over again, but now we have a man. And even though Zhang wanted to write it off as an anomaly, he started to wonder if this missing man was connected to all these missing women. Because by January of 1991, so 2 months after Sue had gone missing without a trace and still had not been reported by anybody, and 6 weeks after that elderly couple reported that man missing, another 5 people from Naha had gone missing, 2 more women and 3 more men. And so now the police in Naha were looking at 26 people, men and women, that had all gone missing very recently out of Naha, and nobody had a clue what happened to them. And importantly, because now there were men who were not sex workers who were going missing, the police couldn't just write this whole thing off as, oh, these sex working women are just going to another city to go do their work there. Like that was not a possibility anymore. Clearly something bad was happening, and the police knew they really needed to do a real investigation here. So finally, in early spring of that year, the police in Naha formed a task unit and legitimately began investigating all these disappearances. But amazingly, there was no information. There was nothing. These people went missing and nobody heard from them. There was no evidence of where they went. There was not even any sign that anything bad happened to them because no bodies had been found. There was no evidence of really anything happening. All the police knew is these 26 people, not including Sue, so she would be the 27th person, had been at this train station and then vanished. And that's all they knew. And it got to the point where this story really began to spread around China, and it became like this running joke that if you don't want to live, go to Naha, because everybody assumed there had to be some sort of serial killer or something happening there who was just roaming the streets, picking people off. Thank you to BetterHelp for sponsoring today's video. I have a highly addictive personality, and in my life, it's been both a blessing and definitely a curse. When I'm focused on a goal, I become totally addicted to it, and as a result of that, I usually accomplish that goal. But when I don't have a goal to pursue, I often turn to alcohol kind of out of boredom, and then that becomes a very unhealthy addiction. It usually starts with a drink or two with my wife over dinner, totally harmless. But very quickly, I spiral and begin hiding alcohol around the house and drinking by myself in the garage secretly at midnight after my family's asleep. And invariably, my wife always finds out eventually, and we have the same talk every single time where I promise her I'm never going to do it again, but the cycle always continues. However, this month, with the help of my therapist, I finally decided enough was enough. For my family, for myself, I have to be sober. And so far, sobriety has actually been kind of great. Granted, I'm 3 weeks into the process, but I'll tell you, this time it feels permanent. And I really attribute that to working with my therapist. They're really a big part of the reason that I saw just how destructive alcohol is in my life. So if deep down you feel like you do have some big change you have to make at some point, really consider giving therapy a try, because I'm telling you, their perspective, which you don't have, is the thing you're likely missing. They're able to show you what's going to happen if you don't make that change. Obviously, therapy is not a one-size-fits-all solution, but I'm telling you, it's a great starting point if you're in a similar position to mine. And a very accessible therapy option is a totally online therapy platform called BetterHelp. All you have to do is fill out a quick survey online, and then you'll be quickly matched up with a licensed therapist who will listen and give you helpful, unbiased advice. Let BetterHelp connect you to a therapist who can support you right from the comfort of your own home. Visit betterhelp.com/Mrballen or select Mrballen during sign up to enjoy a special discount on your first month. By late summer of 1991, when really this story had taken hold across the country and was becoming a bigger and bigger deal because there was absolutely no resolution here, police had no idea what was going on, well, the whole situation got a whole lot worse because now, in addition to people suddenly vanishing at the train station in Naha, more people were also going missing in other cities nearby Naha, but all along the same train line that left out of Naha. So more train stations, more disappearances all around the area, not just the city of Naha, but all around. And by the fall of that year, when over 30 people had gone missing all the same way from these train stations all around Naha, the police still had absolutely nothing to go on. All they had is, here are these people, here's where they were, they vanished, we got nothing else, no bodies, no evidence, nothing. But all that would change on October 22nd, 1991, roughly a year after Sue met Gia at the train station in Naha and then drank that drugged tea. On that October day in 1991, so again, a year after the disappearance of Sue, police at this train station, 1,700 miles away from the city of Naha, were doing random stops of commuters on the train platform. This had nothing to do with the ongoing investigation into all these missing people. This was just like public safety stuff, where the police were kind of just walking around, looking for people who looked suspicious, and then checking in on them to make sure they weren't doing anything illegal. And on this particular day, at this train station far away from Naha, one of these officers spotted this very handsome guy in a beautiful brown wool coat and very fancy pants and shoes, and he stood out a lot because of, frankly, how beautiful he was. And so the police officer saw him, and this very handsome guy looked up, and he saw the police officer, and it was like immediately he did something very suspicious. He reached down, grabbed a bag, and quickly turned around and began walking away. And at the same time, two other people who were right near this very handsome guy did the same thing. They grabbed bags off the ground, quickly turned around, fell in line with this handsome guy, and began quickly walking away from the police. And so the police obviously are totally suspicious. They run across the platform and they manage to stop all three of them, and they turn them around and they say, "Show me your bags, open them up." And the police, they would open up these bags and they contain drugs. And so right away, these three know they are caught, but they don't say anything. They just stand there and they're totally silent as the police are asking them, like, what are these drugs? Where are you going with these? What's going on here? They're not talking. And so finally the police go, "Give me your IDs right now." And so all three of them cough up their IDs, and the very handsome guy with the beautiful brown wool coat and fancy clothes, well, that was Gia Wang. The same Gia Wang who had gone with Sue into his house and given her the drugged tea. But again, these police officers are only concerned about the drugs. They don't know anything about these guys. They don't know that Gia met Sue and did this thing at his house with the tea. That wasn't even reported to police. Nobody knew about it. But these police knew they had caught these three people with these bags of illegal drugs, so they brought them back to the station and began to question each of them. And when they spoke to Gia, Gia said nothing. However, when they spoke to the two other people that were with Gia, one of them began to crack. It was obvious they had more to tell about these drugs, and they were kind of holding back tears, like they were very upset. And one of the interrogators, sensing one of these people was prepared to confess to something, instead of really drilling down on them, he was very comforting. And he offered them a blanket and said, "Here, take this blanket, relax, it's okay. You can tell me what's on your mind, it's okay." And that just totally broke this person. And they said, "These drugs are nothing. You need to see what's in Gia's house. That will put these drugs to the side. They won't matter. What's in his house is horrible." The next day, a phone rang in the police station in Naha, and Officer Zhang picked it up, and it was one of the officers who interviewed these three people with drugs and got this whole horrible confession about what was inside of this guy Gia's house, and he told Zhang all about it. And as Zhang is listening to this, his eyes went wide because he knew this had to be connected to all these people going missing. Like, this has to be it. And so as soon as he hung up the phone, Officer Zhang rounded up 20 other police officers and 10 forensic doctors to go search Gia's house. And when they got there, the house from the outside looked just as beautiful as when Sue had seen it for the first time and felt like her reservations about Gia had gone down because of how wonderful his house looked. But as soon as all those police officers and the forensic doctors stepped inside of Gia's house, he wasn't home, there was nobody there. When they went inside, they were instantly hit with this horrible, horrible smell inside the house. Even though things are neat and beautiful inside too, there was something bad inside this house. And the smell seemed to be coming from the basement. And so at some point, Officer Zhang and the other officers, they got to the door, they opened it up, and they looked down, and all they could see was just this dark room down there, and the smell was so strong. But they pulled their shirts up over their faces, and they went down the stairs, and when they got down there, they couldn't see anything. It's totally dark. But the smell at this point was so overpowering that a couple of the officers almost fainted. And so literally they had to leave the house fearing they were breathing in toxic chemicals or something, and they had to wear gas masks just to go back into the house and back down into the basement. And when they got back down there, now wearing their masks, it didn't seem like there was anything down there that could produce such an awful smell. Like there was just nothing down there. But eventually one of the officers moved to the middle of the basement, right in the middle, and they realized there was an opening. And they looked down into it and they couldn't believe what they saw. And at the same time, somebody upstairs made an equally horrifying discovery because they discovered a videotape, a VHS cassette, that contained this horrible footage that effectively explained what was going on inside of that pit in the basement. But to understand that, we need to go back a year to when Sue met Gia at the train station. She went back to his house and drank the drug tea and blacked out. After Sue drank that tea, she didn't die. Gia did not kill her. Instead, she woke up a few hours later being totally confused, and she was immediately hit by this horrible smell, but it was totally pitch black. She can't see anything, and she began feeling her hands around her, and she felt stone everywhere she touched, and eventually she realized she was in what felt like the bottom of a well. But it wasn't water she was standing in. She was standing in something that almost felt like jelly, and she began kind of touching it to figure out what it was. She could not tell, but she couldn't help but feel like the things around her were kind of moving, like they were alive. And then suddenly a lid that clearly sat atop of this pit began to slide over above her. And so suddenly light was coming down into this pit. And at first, Sue looked up and she didn't see anything, but then she looked down and realized what was all around her. It was people, dead people, and potentially even half alive people that were just stuffed into this big pit that were all kind of decaying or, slowly dying or whatever it was. And she's just standing amongst it all. And then she looks up and she sees it's Gia, the beautiful man who had brought her here. He's standing up there looking down at her with a smile on his face. And Sue immediately pleads with him to please spare me, don't kill me. And Gia, he looks down at her kind of inquisitively, and he says, if I lift you out of there, will you do anything I tell you to do? And Sue said, yes, I'll do anything. Just get me out of here, please. And so Gia, he reached down, he grabbed Sue, and he pulled her up and out of this pit inside of his basement. A few days later, Sue was back at the train station where she had met Gia for the first time, but this time she was alone. And she walked up onto that train platform with no intention of riding a train. Instead, as soon as she got up there, she began looking around, and then she spotted a businessman who was sitting on a bench. And she walked over to him, and she sat down next to him, and we don't know exactly what she said, but we think what she said was something maybe sexually suggestive or, something along those lines, and she's holding his shoulders and touching his hand. She doesn't know this man, and this man is very caught off guard by this, but he's kind of going along with it. And before long, she takes this businessman's hand, they stand up, and they walk out of the train station down to the street, and they make their way a couple blocks over to Gia's house. And when they get there, Sue leads into the front door, she opens it up, she brings the man inside, the door shuts, they take their shoes off, and Sue leads this man into the kitchen where Gia is waiting with a wire between each hand. And as soon as this businessman walked into the kitchen, Gia pounced on him, wrapped the wire around his neck and held it until the man passed out. And then he released the wire. And then Gia and Sue took this man, they lifted him up, and they carried him down into the basement and laid him out on the floor. So he's not in the pit, he's just out in the middle of the basement floor. Then Gia stepped away, picked up a video camera, turned it on, and began to film. He was filming the man on the ground and also Sue. And Sue, she knew what to do. She was going to do anything she was told to do. So she climbed on top of this still very much alive businessman who's just been knocked unconscious, and she straddles him so she's looking down at his head. Then she picks up a knife and she holds it in front of her, And then she looks up at Gia, who at this point has zoomed the camera in. She can hear the sound, the mechanics inside of the camera as it's zooming in on what she's about to do. And then she raises the knife over her head and drives it into this man's chest. The video that Gia shot of Sue murdering this man was the video police found on the first floor of the house shortly after police had found this horrible pit in Gia's basement. It would turn out that Gia Wang was absolutely the serial killer who was responsible for all these people going missing from the train stations. He would abduct them just like he did Sue, and he would bring them to his house, and then he would do horrible, horrible things to them, and eventually he would chuck their bodies into this pit. And so when he abducted Sue, he actually thought that when he drugged her, that he had killed her, and he had chucked her into the pit, believing she was dead. But when Sue had woken up inside of that pit, when he opened it up and looked down, and there she was, fully alive, he had an idea. Well, why don't I turn Sue into a murderer like me? She can help me. And so that was the condition for her being pulled out of this pit, that she would assist him in murdering people, and she agreed to do it. And so the reason the profile of victims changed from sex working women to random men is because those are the people that Sue went after. She began targeting men. And so when that elderly couple came in and reported to Officer Zhang that a man was missing, that was Sue's first victim, the man who had been seen on video being stabbed in the chest by Sue. Now, nobody to this day understands why Sue actually went along with this. Like, she was pulled up out of the pit, but then when she was told to go to the train station and find your first victim, it's unclear why she didn't just go to the police and say, hey, there's a serial killer, Gia, here's his house, here's where he is, go get him. For some reason, she just did what he said. And in fact, Sue was not the only person who was brought into this murdering scheme. He managed to convince 3 other people, including his ex-wife, to also commit murders for him. And all 3 of those people also had ample opportunity to flee and tell police, but they didn't. All of these people just did what Gia wanted without asking any questions. It was like he had absolute control over these people. That is, until that day in October of 1991, when those police officers doing a public safety check spotted Gia along with 2 accomplices fleeing with drugs. And they stopped them and they got them back to the station, and one of his accomplices finally broke and told the truth. And the person who told the truth, the accomplice who broke, was Sue. She was there with him at the train station. Nobody knew she was missing, and she was the one who, when offered a blanket and was told, tell us the truth, she came clean. Ultimately, it was this police officer's kindness that broke her. In Gia's basement, inside of that horrible pit, right in the middle of it, were 42 bodies, 24 women and 18 men. In the end, Gia and all 4 of his forced accomplices, including Sue, were sentenced to death, and they were executed on January 24th, 1992. Today, the city of Naha is still just as infamous as it was in the 90s when these murders took place. And in fact, the nickname for Naha is now just Bandit City to reflect what happened there. I want to create a mildly effective I want to make a mildly effective cold medicine made exclusively out of Egyptian fire ants. Take its horn off its head and you beat it to death. Sing out! Die. You die. Turned and leapt head first out the glass window. Pow! Yes! Got up on its flippers and began chasing us down the cave. A nice hot maga monster. And we settled on a piping hot plate of eagle tonsils, your smoked chicken gallbladder eggnog, your zebra cornea souffle. Get to go surfing. Surfing. But it no! Pow! Yes, it did.
Papa, tu dois avoir.
Papa, tu dois avoir. Lungy was already in there, and he looks at me and he says, Papaye, deveríamos ter ficado con Hello Fresh. Oh, Lungy, put on... Ooh, Mr. Mrballen, ooh. It's not even funny. If you're wondering why I just shared a whole slew of me just butchering my various intros and different parts of strange, dark, and mysterious videos, well, it's because you all asked for it. Last month, in our first ever Mrballen newsletter, we posed a question. We said, what do you want me to share with you the most? And overwhelmingly, what you all wanted to see was a compilation of bloopers. And you don't want to miss the next newsletter because maybe there's something else you want to see, and that newsletter might give you a chance to actually see that thing happening. And also, remember, the newsletter encompasses basically everything we're up to, both things that are coming up in the future, things that you might have missed, what we're doing now, and it's designed to be really easy to consume. It's very visual. It's not all text. It's very beautiful. It's an incredibly good newsletter. And so to sign up, all you got to do is go to ballenstudios.com and input your email, and boom, you're signed up. Also, you can just click the link in the description below. That will also get you signed up for the newsletter. And then we will deliver it to you, once a month, and boom, there you go. You're in the know. So thank you to all the people who have already signed up. And in advance, thank you so much to those that are about to go sign up. And I'm sorry to those that plan to not sign up, because really, you're missing out. And you know what? Seagull Lung, he's going to be pretty disappointed in you, so there's that too. Okay, peer pressure. Go get it done. ballenstudios.com. Sign up for our incredible monthly newsletter. Thank you so much. See ya. Wait, don't go anywhere. If you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious videos, click here. Divine intervention is when a deity, so God or a god, becomes actively involved in human affairs here on Earth. Now, of course, we don't know if divine intervention is a real thing, but today's story certainly offers compelling evidence that it might be. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So, if that's of interest to you, please use all your life savings to build this beautiful luxury home right on the coastline to be used as an Airbnb, and then finally, after years of work, when it's all done, tell the like button that they can stay in the Airbnb for the first time. They're the first guest, all for free. Go enjoy it. But don't tell them about all the human-hating, highly aggressive honey badgers you've hid under all the beds. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. Late on the evening of November 15th, 1884, a 20-year-old man named John Lee helped his sister Elizabeth clear the dining room table in the English manor where they both worked. John was a butler at this manor, and his sister Elizabeth was a cook. And the manor itself had a name. It was called the Glen, and it was this gorgeous property right on the beach in the seaside community in England. Now, years ago, the Glen had been much more grand, and in fact, the King and Queen of England had at one point came to stay at the Glen. But recently, the Glen and the family who owned it had fallen on hard times. The staff was down to a skeleton crew of just John, his sister Elizabeth, and 2 elderly maids, which meant virtually all the physical labor at this property fell to John to take care of. So, on this night, John was lugging a huge pile of heavy china in his arms to bring out to the kitchen, and as he was doing this, he was trying to talk to his sister, who was also kind of helping clear the table, about an upcoming dinner party they were going to host at the Glen for some very important lawyers and politicians. But as John tried to talk to Elizabeth, Elizabeth just wasn't really reacting. She was kind of staring off into space, and she was only carrying 1 or maybe 2 plates off the dining room table, while John is carrying like 50. And so John was becoming really annoyed with his sister. I mean, she's not really helping, and she's ignoring him. And so John was about to complain to his sister about her behavior when suddenly she turned around and she apologized to him and said, "You know what? I'm sorry I'm acting this way. I just don't feel very good, and I really think I should go lie down." Now, John was about to be really annoyed at this, but then he noticed his sister had her hands kind of reflexively over her stomach. And John knew his sister was pregnant, and so suddenly he felt like, okay, the reason she's acting this way must be because of her pregnancy. And so he did not press the issue. Now, you need to understand that Elizabeth did not tell John that she was pregnant, nor did she tell anybody else in the house, because the owners of the Glen were very traditional and very religious, and they almost certainly would not approve of Elizabeth's pregnancy because she wasn't married. At the time in England, it was not okay to have babies out of wedlock. It was viewed as like this totally taboo thing that you should never do. But despite Elizabeth's best efforts to conceal her pregnancy, John and the other two elderly maids very quickly realized what was going on, because every morning they would see Elizabeth vomiting because of morning sickness. And so when they approached her and said, hey, it looks like you're pregnant, what's going on here? Elizabeth refused to talk about it. She did not admit to being pregnant. She just kind of said, leave me alone. I mean, John didn't even know who the father was. Like, Elizabeth did not want to talk to anyone about her pregnancy. But despite all that, John and the other two maids really wanted to support Elizabeth and help her get through this pregnancy, without being found out and potentially fired because of it. So when Elizabeth said to John that she just wanted to go lie down because she was feeling sick, he didn't press the issue, and he just told her, you know what? I'm fine. I'll finish up. You go lay down. I hope you feel better. By 11 p.m., John was nearly done with all of his chores and he was getting ready for bed when one of the elderly maids came into the room and told John it was time for their nightly prayers. And without any hesitation, John put down the silverware that he was polishing and followed the maid into the living room where one of the owners of the Glen was waiting in her nightclothes. The owner was a 68-year-old woman named Emma Case, and at night she really liked to lead a nightly prayer with her staff. It was something she really enjoyed doing. Now, John was not a very religious person, but he really cared about Emma, and so he agreed to do these nightly prayers really just to make her happy. I mean, after all, Emma had basically saved him on multiple occasions. John had begun working for Emma 6 years earlier when he was just 14 years old. And John, he was kind of like a rough kid and a troublemaker, but Emma, she just had a soft spot for him. And at some point, when John admitted to Emma that he was really interested in traveling the world someday, Emma would help him get into the British Royal Navy. And for 2 years, John very happily served in the military and did get to see the world. But at the 2-year mark, John came down with this terrible case of pneumonia, and it forced him to leave the military early. And so when John was medically discharged, he came back home and he had no idea what he was going to do. I mean, he anticipated staying in the Navy for some time, not just 2 years. But luckily, Emma stepped in again, and she gave this glowing recommendation of John to one of her very wealthy friends, basically saying, hey, you should hire John. And this wealthy friend of Emma's agreed and hired John, and John was so happy, so relieved. I mean, Emma has totally picked him up again. But after getting hired, John would make a totally stupid mistake. He would steal this really expensive plate from this wealthy friend, and he would get caught. And this wealthy friend, they didn't just scold John and make him give the plate back. They got the police involved, and ultimately John would be sent to prison for 6 months for the theft. And when John got out again, he was certain nobody was going to hire him. I mean, he just went to jail for stealing. But that was when Emma, for a third time, stepped in and helped John again. Emma was a big believer in forgiving people and giving them additional chances when they screwed up. And so she said to John, you know what? I understand you made a mistake. Why don't you come back to the Glen and work for me? You can be our butler. John couldn't believe it. I mean, he knew he did not deserve this chance, especially from Emma, who's now been done wrong by him multiple times. But, he was so grateful, and he said to Emma, I'll take this, of course, and I will do anything you want, no matter what. I will do the best possible job. I'm not going to screw this up. And so far, that was exactly what John had done since coming back to the Glen. He did whatever Emma wanted, and that included nightly prayers. So on this night, after John walked into the dining room, he took a seat next to Emma at the table, and then after Elizabeth and the other two elderly maids took their seats at the table, they all held hands and they bowed their heads, and then Emma began to lead them in prayer. When the service was over, the two maids got up and headed to the kitchen to make a cup of hot cocoa for Emma. Emma typically stayed up really, really late, basically later than anybody else in the house, and she liked to drink hot cocoa and just sit by the fire and, read and write letters. It was just kind of her time to be alone and to be left alone. And so after the maids had gone, John stood up too, and he said goodnight to Emma and told her to enjoy the rest of her night, and then he made his way into the kitchen and he went into the pantry, which doubled as his bedroom. And once in the pantry, he pulled out his cot, climbed under the covers, and he fell asleep. A few hours later, at about 3:30 in the morning, John suddenly woke up in the pantry to the sound of somebody screaming outside the door. And so John, he burst out of the pantry door, and right away he's looking in the kitchen, and it's just completely covered in smoke. He can barely see, but not far from him in the kitchen was his sister and also one of the maids. And they were the ones screaming. And they were actually screaming at John to wake up and go get everybody. We need to get them out of the house and get some help. And so John, his first instinct is, okay, clearly there's a fire or something. And Emma, she's upstairs and she could be in trouble. And so John, he instinctively ran towards the stairs and began going up to the second floor to save Emma. But as he went up the stairs, the other maid was coming down the stairs looking totally frantic, and she would tell John that she was just in Emma's bedroom and she couldn't see Emma anywhere, and her bed was totally on fire, and so she didn't know if Emma was even in there, but it didn't look good. And so John, at this point, he turned and went with that maid back to the kitchen, where they linked up with John's sister and that other maid, and the four of them filled up buckets of water and tried to run back up the stairs to attempt to put out the fire that was in Emma's bedroom. But by the time they got back upstairs, the fire up there had really spread, and there was like a wall of fire right in front of Emma's bedroom. So there was no way to really get through it, and their little buckets of water did nothing. And so even though they hated the idea of leaving Emma potentially behind, the four of them knew they couldn't do anything more. And so finally, the four of them turned and began running downstairs to evacuate. And as they ran through the dining room on the first floor, they would find Emma. She was laying on the ground, sprawled out, and it was obvious to all four of them that she was clearly dead. However, it was also obvious that the fire had not killed her. She had clearly been hacked to death. She had all these horrible wounds on her head that looked like somebody had taken an axe basically to her head, and her neck was so deeply cut, it was almost like someone tried to remove her head. John and Elizabeth and the two maids just stood there staring in shock at Emma, not even sure what to do. And then one of the maids just started screaming, and then all four of them just turned and ran out of the house. Eventually, some neighbors, some local fishermen, and members of the Coast Guard were able to put out the fire at the Glen. But this was not just a fire, this was a murder. And so when police came to investigate, suspicion immediately fell on John. This was back in the day, well before forensic science was used in investigations. And so at the time, the way police kind of figured out who done it is by intuition and gut feeling and assumptions. I mean, it was basically like pseudoscience. But at the time, that's how it was. And quickly, the police determined that whoever had killed Emma and inflicted these horrible injuries on her, they had to be really strong. And so the assumption was, John is the only man in the house, and so very likely the strongest person in the house. And so he must have been the one to do this, because it didn't look like anybody else had the strength to do this. Also, the investigators found these blood trails underneath the rubble from the fire that showed Emma had not actually been murdered where she was found on the ground in the dining room. Instead, she had actually been killed in the hallway near the stairs, which was not far from the pantry where John slept. And basically right outside of John's pantry door was a bloody hatchet and a bloody knife. And on top of all of that, investigators also determined that the fire had been set intentionally, and the person who set it had used this particular type of oil that was very flammable, and they had doused it all over the house and ignited it. And it turned out the only place where this oil was located inside of the Glen was inside of the pantry where John slept. So on the same day this whole fire breaks out and they find Emma dead, John was arrested for Emma's murder. Hey everybody, if you've not heard by now, our flagship podcast, Mrballen Podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, that pretty much immediately rocketed to the top of the charts when we launched in 2022, and then quickly was scooped up by Amazon by the end of the same year. Yeah, that show, our top show, is now available everywhere. It is no longer just on Amazon Music, it's on all platforms, and it's free. Which means if you've not listened to this podcast since it went exclusive with Amazon Music back in November of 2022, then that means you have about 100 news stories that are only on the podcast that are only now being made available to everybody. So go binge them. And if you signed up for Amazon Music just for this podcast, I love you. Thank you so much. But most importantly, there are still going to be perks for you if you continue to listen to the podcast on Amazon Music. Prime members will get to listen to the Mrballen podcast 30 days earlier than everybody else, and Prime members will get to listen to the podcast on Amazon Music with no ads. But again, the Mrballen podcast is now available worldwide on every podcast platform, and it's totally free. So please, if you would, go find the Mrballen podcast on your choice podcast platform, whether that's Amazon Music or Spotify or Apple or whatever. Give us a follow, listen to an episode, and then please rate the podcast and leave a review. It does an enormous amount for the growth of the show. I'd really appreciate it. All right, back to the stories. The next day, John was in his jail cell, and a guard came down the hall and rapped on the bars and told John he had a visitor. His lawyer was here to talk to him. But John was confused because he didn't have a lawyer, so he had no idea who this was. But regardless, the guard opened up the cell and he led John down the hallway to this room. And when John walked in, he saw there was this man who was very well dressed and very handsome. He was sitting at this table, and clearly he was waiting for John. And John, at first he didn't really know who this guy was. But then it dawned on him that he knows who this guy is. And it made no sense that he was here to defend John. The man's name was Reginald Templar, and he was a very successful lawyer, highly respected in the area, and he also happened to be one of Emma's absolute closest friends. So Reginald Templar, Emma's close friend, the woman who's been murdered, is here to defend the person who's accused of killing Emma? It just didn't make any sense. But eventually, Reginald gestured for John to come in the room and sit down. And so John just kind of made his way in and he sat down, and Reginald immediately said, "John, I know you did not kill Emma. That's why I'm here." John was so relieved, and before long, he was pouring out all the information he could about everything he could recall about the night of the fire and the murder. And as he did, Reginald took all these notes, and he began creating a framework for John's defense. And so by the time John was back in his jail cell, he couldn't help but feel kind of optimistic that maybe with Reginald's help, he could actually beat this thing and prove he didn't do this. But John's relief would be short-lived. His first court appearance went extremely well. Reginald showed up in a fancy suit, and he was just completely on his game and just ripped the prosecution apart and basically said their entire case was just circumstantial, and he rattled off all these legal precedents, which John didn't really understand, but he looked up and saw the judge definitely knew these precedents and was impressed with what Reginald was doing. And then also Reginald would say that the police did a terrible job investigating. They basically didn't investigate and just jumped to conclusions that it was John. And so as Reginald is basically destroying the prosecution, Reginald looked over at the prosecutor, and he could tell the prosecutor looked really nervous. And so John was really starting to feel confident that Reginald was exactly what he needed. But on the day of the second court appearance, Reginald just didn't show up. With no explanation, he didn't contact anybody, and so John just sat there waiting to see what was going to happen. The judge delayed for as long as he could, but eventually when, Reginald still didn't show up, the judge looked to John and said, "I'm sorry, but you're going to have to defend yourself." Which, of course, John did not know how to do. I mean, he barely had even gone to school, let alone studied law. And from there, things only got worse for John. Reginald continued to miss court dates with no explanation, and then on other times he would show up to court, but instead of being this fantastic, very sharp lawyer, he kind of acted like a maniac. He would start all these unnecessary fights with the judge over totally irrelevant matters, like how to pronounce a particular word, and then when he had witnesses on the stand, his line of questioning didn't make any sense. He would ask things like, "Well, what did you have for breakfast today?" and "What's your favorite color?" And then finally, Reginald just withdrew altogether from the case, leaving John with no lawyer at all, which admittedly might have actually been an improvement for John. After Reginald withdrew, another lawyer found out about it and took pity on John and volunteered to take on the case. But it was on very short notice, and this other lawyer had good intentions, but was not nearly as skilled as Reginald was when he was kind of on his game on that first day. And so really quickly, this lawyer kind of fumbled the case, and then when it went to the jury to decide whether or not John was guilty, it took them less than an hour to come back and say, "Oh yeah, he's guilty, he killed Emma." And so John was sentenced to death by hanging. For the next 3 months, John sat in his jail cell waiting for his execution. And as he waited, he continually insisted that he really was innocent and that ultimately God would protect him. Finally, February 23rd, 1885 rolled around. This was the day of John's execution, except something very weird happened on this day. When John was led from the jail to the gallows where he was going to be executed, the hangman could not get the gallows to work. The trap door in the gallows where the condemned stands, where it's supposed to open up and they fall down and the noose breaks their neck, that trap door, it would not function whenever John was standing on it. Now, when John was moved off the trap door, it functioned perfectly fine. It was only when he was on that trap door that it would not work. And so think about this. Pretend you're John. 3 different times, the hangman led him onto that trapdoor. They put the noose around his neck, put a bag over his head, asked him for his last words, and they threw that lever, and each time John is expecting to die, and it's not working. Finally, after the 3rd failure, the hangman just called off the execution, and then actually a judge would weigh in and say, you know what, we cannot possibly attempt for a 4th time to execute John. This constitutes cruel and unusual punishment, and so they swapped his sentence from a death sentence to 22 years in prison. And none of this would make any sense until one day, 6 years after Emma's murder, when John, by this point, was just sitting in a jail cell and everybody had forgotten about him. On that day in 1890, a group of very high society type people, politicians and lawyers and rich people, they all gathered in this misty cemetery not far from the Glen. The group was in the cemetery for the burial of a very important and well-respected man who had died after slowly going insane. And as the priest finished his final blessing, the mourners began chucking handfuls of dirt into the grave, and as they did, one of them said quietly but out loud, "Today, we have buried a murderer." Here's what many people believe really happened on the night of November 15th, 1884, when Emma was killed. At the time of Emma's murder, Elizabeth's pregnancy was very scandalous, but not just for Elizabeth. It was also scandalous for the father of the baby, the father who nobody knew except for Elizabeth. And it was scandalous for this father because, like Elizabeth, he was worried what society would think if they found out he was having a baby out of wedlock, especially with Elizabeth, who basically from a societal standpoint was kind of below his station. But despite all that, the father of the baby did not attempt to distance himself from Elizabeth. Instead, on the night of the murder, the father of the baby actually decided to sneak into the Glen to see Elizabeth. But Emma was still awake. She was up late, drinking her hot cocoa, writing and reading, and she heard the sound of the father coming into her home. And so she got up to go investigate, and she would eventually find the father up in the hallway right outside of Elizabeth's bedroom. And remember, Emma is very traditional, she's very conservative and religious, and she's seeing this strange man in her house clearly going into or coming out of Elizabeth's room, and she was so offended and angry, and so Emma just began screaming at this guy to get out of her house, and if he didn't, she was going to tell the whole world about this illicit relationship. And then Emma walked up and hit this guy right in the face, and at this point, the father just snapped, and he flew into this rage, and he began screaming back at Emma, and then he grabbed a hatchet that was on the wall right near the pantry, he pulled it off, and he brought it down right on top of Emma's head, and Emma crumpled to the ground. And the man, he's looking down at Emma and he's realizing he's inflicted this horrific injury on Emma, and if she doesn't die, she's gonna tell someone, and then this father is gonna go to jail, if not worse. So in a moment of panic, this father runs into the kitchen, gets a kitchen knife, comes back, and he finished Emma off. Once she was deceased, he dragged her back to the dining room where she normally did her reading and writing, and then he doused her and the whole house in that weird oil that he found in the pantry where John was sleeping, and after getting the whole house covered in it, he ignited it, and then he ran out of the house. But over the next 6 years, Emma's killer felt so bad about what he had done, both to Emma and then nearly killing Elizabeth and his unborn child, that he went completely insane, and this caused his physical health to totally fail, and he died. But right before he died, as he's laying in his deathbed, he began ranting and raving about all the things he regretted in his life, including murdering a woman at a big, beautiful seaside estate. Basically, he was admitting to killing Emma, and he did it in the company of all the people who would then be at his burial, and so that's why as they're throwing the dirt onto his casket, they're saying, "Today we buried a murderer." The killer's identity was none other than Reginald Templar, John's lawyer. Now, nobody knows if Reginald took John's case because he felt guilty and wanted to prevent an innocent man from going to jail, or if he just wanted to sabotage John's case to ensure he did go to jail to protect himself. We don't know. Either way, though, it was during the course of this trial that Reginald began his descent into madness, which would ultimately lead to his death. Some people believe the reason the gallows malfunctioned every time John stood on that trapdoor and it wouldn't open was because of divine intervention. That God or a god or some deity came to earth and literally interfered with the execution to spare John's life. And the reason people think that is because, John really was an innocent man and he did not deserve to die. John would serve all 22 years of his sentence, and then when he got out, he became famous for being the man who could not be hanged. John would eventually get married, and he would move to America, where he would live a very happy and quiet life until he died at the age of 81. Hey everybody, as mentioned earlier, right now you can listen to over 100 new stories on the Mrballen podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. It's available on all of them. And so right now, I'm going to play you a clip from an episode of the Mrballen podcast. It's called Rendezvous in Capistrano. Enjoy. At 10 p.m. that night, Deputy Tony Castillo of the Orange County Sheriff's Department was in his cruiser out on his usual rounds. Deputy Castillo eased off the gas when he noticed a silver Dodge Stratus car pulled over in the breakdown lane on a rural highway outside of San Juan Capistrano. It was pitch black and there wasn't much traffic. Castillo figured there wasn't a reason for anyone to stop right there unless they were having car trouble, so he decided he would walk over and see if they needed any help. Castillo pulled his cruiser in behind the car. He could see that the car's engine was still running and the high beam lights were on, and the passenger side door was wide open. Just ahead of the car on the side of the road, Castillo saw a pole with an emergency phone box attached to it. He thought maybe the passenger in this car had jumped out of the car after it pulled over to go use that call box to call for help, because maybe their car had broken down. But then Castillo noticed a woman's bare foot sticking out of that open passenger door, and he knew right then something had to be wrong. Castillo radioed to let dispatch know what he'd found and that he was now going to go investigate. Then Castillo got out of the cruiser, put his right hand on his holster, and began walking towards the back of the Dodge. Castillo's footsteps on the gravel were the only sound. Castillo saw what looked like a smear of blood on the back passenger side door, but he went around to the driver's side and he saw right away the front window was smashed, and Castillo saw a scene of pure horror inside the car. A man was slumped over in the driver's seat, still wearing a seatbelt, and a woman who had been in the passenger seat was sprawled across the front seat, basically on the driver, with her head on the man's lap. Both of them had been shot multiple times, and they were drenched in blood, and when Castillo checked both of them for a pulse, he found they had none. They were both dead. Castillo rushed back to his cruiser, and he radioed dispatch to tell them that he had just walked up on 2 apparent homicide victims out on Ortega Highway. Then Castillo ran the plates on the Dodge Stratus, and the vehicle came back as being registered to Ken and Carolyn Stahl. And while he couldn't know for sure quite yet, Castillo was reasonably certain that those were the 2 victims. If you like that trailer and you want to hear the whole story, just go ahead and look up the Mrballen podcast on any podcast platform. It's free. And then once you find it on Apple, Spotify, wherever, just give the show a follow and then start your binge. Or you can listen early and ad-free on Amazon Music. But again, the Mrballen podcast is available on all podcast platforms. Go follow, go listen. So that's going to do it. If you want more strange, dark, and mysterious stories, then you need to check out all the Ballen Studios podcasts. You can find all of those podcasts simply by searching for Ballen Studios on any podcast platform. Okay, that's going to do it. Until next time, see ya. Wait, don't go anywhere. If you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious videos, click here. Today's story is about a group of internet gamers who played together for years. But one day, in their online world, the line between reality and fantasy suddenly blurred, and nobody could tell what was real and what was fake, until it was too late. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please adjust the like button's power seats in their car to a very uncomfortable position, and then rip out the fuse. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. At 3:30 p.m. on July 27, 2019, a 22-year-old college student named Nicole logged onto her gaming computer in her bedroom in North Carolina. Nicole had spent the morning and the early part of the afternoon studying, but now she could finally kick back and relax and play her favorite video game. an online multiplayer combat game called Perfect World, where people battled each other as characters inspired by Chinese mythology. Perfect World was a pretty niche game, so not a whole lot of people played it or even knew about it, but Nicole loved it, and she played it basically every day for the past few years, was totally hooked on it, and in playing it, she had met about a dozen other people from all over the world who also were obsessed with this game. And together, they had formed a virtual community, and they used a messaging app called Discord to communicate with each other outside of the game. So, on this particular day, after Nicole loaded up Perfect World, she also opened up her Discord chat, and she saw already that several of her friends were online, and they were all talking on the general chat inside of their server. And so Nicole began perusing the messages, and she saw the general theme of the messages being passed was about one of the other users on their server, somebody who went by the username Menhaz. So as far as everyone knew on this Discord server, Menhaz, they didn't know his real name, was a college student, and he was basically known to be a huge troll, which meant he said and did really offensive things, in particular on this Discord server, just to get people's reactions. Because of his trolling behavior, he had actually been previously kicked out of the server and also kicked out of the game Perfect World, like the game they're all connected on this Discord server through. He had been booted from both of those platforms in the past, but in previous occasions when that happened, Menhaz would plead his case and say he's not going to do it anymore, he's going to behave, and eventually the moderators would just let him back in. And so currently, Menhaz was back on the Discord server, and he was back to his trolling ways. But as Nicole scanned through the general chat and went back and actually saw what Menhaz had been saying that day, that basically had stirred up everybody else on the server to say, look, he's back to his trolling ways, when she went back and actually saw what Menhaz was saying, Nicole couldn't help but feel like today's trolling just felt different. Menhaz was talking about this apparently brilliant 4-step plan he had that was going to completely revolutionize his life and basically set him up for big success in his life going forward. However, this plan he was talking about, this 4-step plan, was not only totally outrageous, but just seemed impossible. Like what he was saying he was going to do just didn't seem possible even by Menhaz's standards. Like within his trolling standards, this was a bridge too far. Like this isn't even trolling, this is just weird what you're proposing. And so basically the chatter on the Discord server this day that Nicole was seeing was how nobody believed this 4-step plan was a real thing. Like this is just classic Menhaz trolling. And Nicole too, she also did not believe this plan was serious. She did not think for a second Menhaz was going to do this. And so she just kind of rolled her eyes, ignored Menhaz, minimized the Discord server, and just enjoyed playing the game, Perfect World. And after a while, after a couple of battles that she won and a couple of battles that she lost in this game, she paused for a second and noticed there was a whole bunch of new notifications on their Discord server. And so because Nicole was already taking a break from the game, she opened up the Discord server to see what was going on. And right away she saw the main topic of discussion was once again Menhaz and his 4-step plan, but specifically Menhaz had just sent a picture through the Discord server that apparently represented completing step 1 of this 4-step plan. He basically said, look, I did it. I've done 1. I'm on to step 2 now. And everybody's looking at this picture thinking, wait a minute, he's actually doing this? This can't be real. And Nicole, when she looked at this picture, she too thought like, no way, this is not possible. He did not do this. And in fact, her first thought was, okay, maybe this image was, created by AI or something, or, maybe he pulled this image off a website somewhere and is pretending it's authentic, but it can't possibly be something he actually took a picture of. He couldn't have done this. And so pretty quickly, Nicole, despite seeing this image, she agreed with the consensus that Menhaz is still just trolling us. This picture is not proof that he's really doing this 4-step plan. And so Nicole went back to playing Perfect World, and about an hour later, she noticed there were all sorts of new notifications on her Discord server. And so once again, she stopped her game, she opened up the Discord server, and once again, the entire chat was dominated about Menhaz, because Menhaz had sent a second picture, apparently representing him completing the second step of his big 4-step plan. And once again, everyone's saying there's no way, he's trolling us, this can't be real. And Nicole, she looked at the image itself, and she too thought this has got to be trolling. But now, she wasn't just filled with pure disbelief. She wasn't able to just completely discard what was happening here, because part of her was thinking, like, how is Menhaz getting these hyper-specific images that really are tethered to this exact plan he's laid out? Like, how does he have these images? Where are they coming from? Now, this was back in 2019, and certainly AI technology existed, but not the way it does now, where, the average user can literally in seconds create hyper-specific images using AI. In 2019, that really wasn't available to most people, and so really the only way Menhaz could potentially have these images, at least in Nicole's mind, was he had to have pulled them off some website somewhere and basically pretended they were images that he took. And so Nicole decided she was actually going to take the 2 images he had sent and reverse image search them to try to figure out where they came from, find the website, where he's pulling them from, because clearly these pictures are not authentic. There's no way Menhaz actually took these photos. But when Nicole reverse image searched both images, nothing came up. Now, Nicole thought, okay, that does seem to suggest these are authentic pictures he really did take, which maybe means he's actually doing this plan, even though that seemed totally preposterous. Or she thought maybe, these images have been pulled from such an obscure website somewhere that I don't have access to, finding them in a reverse image search, that maybe that's what it is. And so at this point, Nicole told herself, you know what, there's got to be a reasonable explanation for this, but I'll tell you this, it can't be that Menhaz is actually following through on this plan. It's not possible. And so once again, she minimized the Discord server and got back into the game. But pretty quickly, Nicole just stopped playing the game because her mind was totally fixated on whatever was going on with Menhaz. And so she opened up the Discord server again, and she saw still everybody in the chat was talking about Menhaz and these 2 pictures he had sent. And basically the server was divided. About half the members believed this really was just Menhaz trolling, and the other half was starting to think that, hey guys, this might be real. He might actually be carrying out this 4-step plan. Those pictures might be real. And if that's the case, we have a huge problem. Because this plan, if he actually carries it out, is so completely illegal. He can't do this. This is not okay. And so the faction of members on the Discord server that were starting to sense that this 4-step plan of Menhaz's might actually be real began to talk internally, and they said, look, we can't just sit here and do nothing if Menhaz is actually doing this. We have to stop him. This is not okay. And so in fact, one of these members actually contacted their local police and told them, hey, there's this guy on my Discord server, his username is Menhaz, I don't have his actual name, but he's doing something that could be very bad, and you need to look into it. And so the dispatcher said, okay, well, where does Menhaz live? And the person who had called was like, well, I don't actually know. In fact, I really don't know much about him other than the fact that he goes by Menhaz and he sent these crazy pictures that could be real or not, I don't know. And so eventually the dispatcher just said, look, I get it that you're concerned, but we have nothing to go on here. And remember, this is the internet. People make stuff up all the time. And so pretty quickly after that, the police officer just hung up, and that was that. Are you the type of person who has binged basically all of my YouTube videos, and every week you anxiously wait a new upload? If so, thank you, but also you're in luck. Because if you didn't know this, we actually have a separate podcast, the Mrballen podcast, that has literally hundreds of stories that are not on YouTube that you can binge right now. That podcast is available on all podcast platforms. Again, it's just called the Mrballen podcast. And on Mondays on that podcast, we upload exclusive new content that is not on YouTube to the podcast. So that's Mondays. And then on Thursday, we remaster the audio of your favorite videos on YouTube and put those on the podcast. But again, Mondays, those are brand new and exclusive to the podcast. But if you want to hear those exclusive episodes 1 month ahead of Apple and Spotify and all the other platforms, well, there's only one place you can do that, and that's on Amazon Music. So again, you can go to any podcast platform and find the Mrballen podcast, or if you're like me and you hate waiting, then you can listen early and ad-free on Amazon Music. So at this point, Nicole and the other members of the Discord server who were starting to suspect that what Menhaz was doing could be real, at this point, they felt really alone. I mean, the local police was not taking this seriously, which did make sense. I mean, they had nothing to go on. But as a result, it was like nobody was doing anything about what Menhaz was claiming. And Nicole and the other members who, again, were beginning to sense this could be real, they felt terrible about just sitting here doing nothing. And so Nicole and a few other members of the Discord server decided to team up digitally and actually investigate Menhaz themselves, try to figure out like who this guy is and really what's he up to. And so Nicole and this new investigative group started by combing through all the chat logs in their Discord server to see if Menhaz at any point had either intentionally or unintentionally dropped hints about his real name and his location. And eventually they came across a message where Menhaz actually said his real first name was Menhaz. That wasn't just his username, that was his real name. And that was great because Menhaz was a pretty unique name. And so Nicole and the group thought, okay, well, if we find where in the world that name is somewhat common, maybe that will give us a rough idea of where to look for Menhaz in the world. They also knew that Menhaz was a college student, or at least he claimed to be. Now, he never actually said where he went to college, but he would often, in the Discord server, tell people when he was going to be on the server and when he was going to be off the server, like for classes and for studying and that kind of thing. He would say, okay, hey, I'll be on at 6 p.m. tonight, or I'll be off at 9, I'll be back on at 8. He would give these specific times, and he would always use Eastern Standard Time when he did that. And so a natural assumption that Nicole and her group made was, okay, very likely Menhaz lives in the Eastern time zone. And that time zone included the entire east coast of the United States, Eastern and Central Canada, and also some countries in South and Central America. But while that was helpful, it still created too broad of an area in the world for this group to realistically look for Menhaz. It was nearly impossible to actually figure out where he was. But they now had a sense of where he could be, and they thought, okay, well, why don't we ask somebody else in the Discord server if they can try to track Menhaz's IP address? An IP address can be used to find the approximate geographical location of a computer. And sure enough, someone in the server said they could do that, and within a few minutes, they had tracked Menhaz's computer to Toronto, Canada. However, right at the same time they were figuring this out, Menhaz sent a third picture across the Discord server, a picture that showcased him completing step 3 of this 4-step plan, allegedly. And for Nicole and many other members of this Discord server, this third picture really represented a big shift, because now it was getting terrifying. Because look, it seems pretty likely at this point that Menhaz is actually doing this. This is real. How could he possibly have these hyper-specific photos that are perfectly synced with this 4-step plan he had come up with? This feels real. And so Nicole, she actually asked the person who had traced his IP address to Toronto, she said, hey, should we call the Toronto police and tell them what's going on here? You know, maybe they can go find him and stop him before he completes this plan. I mean, he's apparently completed 3 steps. There's only 1 step left. We have to stop him here. But the person who had tracked his IP address to Toronto said, look, what are the police going to do? There's 6 million people that live in Toronto, and all we have is that maybe his computer is in Toronto and maybe these pictures are real. And also, by the way, it's pretty easy to mask your IP address. You can use something called a VPN, or virtual private network, that when you track someone's IP address that has one of those working, it will make it seem like their address is, for example, in Toronto or Chicago or New York or Dallas or anywhere in the world, when in reality, their computer is somewhere totally different. And so the police are not going to launch a manhunt based on an IP address. It's not 100% accurate. And so basically, Nicole realized that even though they saw they are on the precipice, potentially, of Menhaz committing some horrible crime, and they can't do anything about it because they don't really have any information about Menhaz. And so at this point, everybody on the Discord server was basically begging Menhaz to come clean. Tell us these photos are fake. Tell us this plan of yours is really just you trolling. But Menhaz didn't do that. He doubled down and said, oh no, these are all real. And in fact, I'm going to complete step 4 of this plan and complete the whole process in 30 minutes. And after that, all Nicole and the other members of the Discord server could do was just try to convince Menhaz not to do this. Don't follow through with this. Don't complete the plan. You gotta stop. It's not worth it. But Menhaz refused and said, I'm doing this no matter what. And sure enough, 30 minutes later, Menhaz would send one final picture, the 4th picture, showcasing that his 4-step plan was now complete. At this point, someone from the Discord server did call the Toronto police. The following day, at about 3:30 p.m., police officers arrived outside of Menhaz's home, which it would turn out was located in a small town just north of Toronto. The IP address had been correct. By this point, it had now been about 24 hours since Menhaz had sent the very first picture of his four-step plan. Police knocked on the front door, having no idea what to expect here. They had seen the images Menhaz had sent on the Discord server, but at this point, until they went inside, they had no idea if they were dealing with a terrible crime or a terrible joke. When the door opened, Menhaz himself was standing in the doorway. He had a totally neutral, very calm expression on his face. He was very gracious. He welcomed the police inside. And when they stepped inside, they asked him, what's going on here? And all Menhaz said was, "You'll see." So the police walked further into the home and eventually made their way upstairs. And when they got up there, they just froze. Because it would turn out, Menhaz was not trolling. Those pictures were not fake. He really had carried out that four-step plan. It would turn out, for the past 4 years, Menhaz had been living a double life. To his friends and family, he was a college student studying engineering, and he was on a path to great success. When in reality, he dropped out of college in his first year and just pretended to go to school every day, when in reality, he would just go to a local mall and hang out there. And then in the evenings, when school was over and he would come back home, he would just immerse himself in video games, specifically that Perfect World game. That's what he did. He just went to the mall and played video games and lied to his friends and family. But July 27th, 2019, the day Menhaz put his four-step plan into action, was literally the last day he could maintain this ruse. Because the next day, July 28th, 2019, was the day Menhaz was scheduled to graduate from his college. And so his friends and family were all expecting to be there and to see this amazing ceremony. And so to deal with the fact that his real life and his fake life were about to collide, Menhaz came up with his four-step plan. And he literally told the members of the Discord server about his big plan, but nobody believed him because he was always trolling people. It just seemed like, oh, this is made up, another one of Menhaz's lies. But he was not lying. It was all true. Those pictures that he sent across were absolutely authentic. He took those pictures, and they did represent completing each step in the plan. The first picture was of his mother, the second picture was of his grandmother, the third picture was of his sister, and the fourth picture was of his father. And in each picture, those people were dead, because Menhaz had spent the day methodically killing his entire family to prevent them finding out about his lie. He hit them over the head with a crowbar and then slit their throats and took a picture, posted it to Discord. By the time someone from Discord finally got in touch with the Toronto police, it was too late. Menhaz had obliterated his entire family. Menhaz ultimately pleaded guilty to 4 counts of murder and was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 40 years. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know in the comments what you thought of today's episode, and also remember, we have hundreds more videos for you to binge right now. But if you want a recommendation of, which video to invest your time in, well, here are 2 great options right here. If you want more Mrballen content, click on this one. And if you want some redacted declassified mysteries with Luke Lamanna, click over here. All right, until next time, see ya. Today, we're going to look at 3 places you can't go and people who went there anyways. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the like button's house and slightly unscrew all of their light bulbs so they don't turn on. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. At 10:30 a.m. on October 30th, 2005, a 33-year-old pastor named Kyle Lake stood on a stage inside of the University Baptist Church in Waco, Texas. Kyle had just finished delivering that morning's sermon to his congregation, which included about 800 people. And now he was about to welcome a new member, a young woman. So Kyle had been the pastor of this church for the last 7 years. And over that time, the church had really grown and evolved, really directly because of Kyle's leadership. He was known as being a very thoughtful and educated pastor, who was also known to be quite fun and progressive. He often would play pranks on the congregation and keep things really light, even if he was in the middle of a very important sermon. And people liked that. It made him relatable. And so because of Kyle's youthful energy that he clearly gave off, he had sort of gradually shifted the congregation to being a much more young crowd. Predominantly the folks who attended the church were college kids, or roughly that age. And also his wife was an attendee at the church, as were his 3 little kids, who at the moment, as he was up on stage, they were across the hall attending kids' Bible study. Now for Kyle, welcoming a new member into this church had become a very big deal for him. He in fact had this special ceremony he would perform for each and every new member. And really the whole congregation got behind this ceremony. And so today, Kyle was about to do this ceremony with this new member, this young woman. And so Kyle, in front of the whole congregation, he calls this woman up, come on up, we're gonna do the ceremony to welcome you to the church. And so the woman, she gets up and she walks up to the front of the stage and she smiles, and Kyle says hello to her and sort of introduces himself, and the whole church is listening. And then Kyle, as part of this ritual, moved to the very center of the stage where the actual ceremony was going to take place. And he was about to call the woman up to join him in the center of the stage when there was a malfunction. Now, the malfunction itself was not really a huge deal. All it did was just stop Kyle for a second, and he had to stop talking to the new member, and he had to figure out what he was gonna do, but quickly he saw a fix that didn't even require him to leave the stage. However, the instant he actually made the fix, when he fixed the malfunction, as he was about to start talking to the whole audience again, he just began to scream. Now, at first, nobody took this seriously because their pastor was known for playing pranks on the congregation. And so everybody just thought it was a prank, albeit a strange one. I mean, he's screaming at the top of his lungs, but everyone's sort of looking around like, this is a prank, right? But then Kyle's screams began to include words. He began screaming, "Help! Help me!" And at that point, it sort of clicked for the whole congregation that this was not a joke. Something was terribly wrong, even though they're looking up at him and nothing appeared to be wrong. Nothing made sense. And so immediately it was like the church spiraled into chaos and confusion. People are bowing their heads, praying as fiercely as they could, praying for his safety. Others are sprinting out of the church, not even knowing what to do. And still more were calling 911, like several people calling 911. And then by the time the paramedics showed up, it was like people still had no idea what actually was happening. In fact, honestly, the paramedics didn't. It was like, what is this? But within a few days, they were able to figure out what happened. And it surprised everyone. So the special ceremony that Kyle would perform for every new member was a baptism. And so when Kyle moved to the very center of the stage, and he actually called up the woman to join him in the center of the stage, he actually was stepping into the baptismal pool. Picture like a hot tub, waist-high water, it's warm water. And so Kyle literally stepped into the hot tub and he's calling up this woman to join him in the pool so she can be baptized. However, before this woman actually got to the pool, Kyle has this malfunction. And all it was is his lapel mic shut off. It wasn't working anymore. And because the church he was in was huge and cavernous, sound really didn't travel well. He needed a microphone to project his voice. And so he had to stop the ceremony for a second and find another microphone. Luckily, there was a stand with a microphone in it right within arm's reach. And so Kyle grabbed it. However, what Kyle didn't know was there actually was a second malfunction that had happened either at this instant or just before, but either way, there was another malfunction that he had no idea about. And that was that the heaters of the baptismal pool that kept the water warm were damaged. And as a result of this damage, the water in that pool had become electrically charged. And so the instant Kyle grabbed that microphone, he grounded the electricity in the pool. Basically, he created a pathway for the electricity to travel through his body. When he began to scream, that was him being electrocuted. Despite the efforts of first responders and the medical staff at the hospital, Kyle unfortunately did not survive. As for Kyle's wife, who literally watched this happen from the front row of the church, she watched her husband be killed. She ultimately sued the electrical company that installed those heaters in the baptismal pool, and she would settle for an undisclosed amount of money. Dive into a world of endless imagination with Audible. Whether you like to listen to stories, seek motivation, or just need expert advice, you can be inspired to imagine new worlds, new possibilities, and a new way of thinking. Audible offers over 1 million audiobooks, as well as podcasts and Audible originals, all in one easy-to-use app. You can easily explore bestsellers, new releases, and thousands of podcasts and audiobooks that you can listen to all you want, with new ones added every day. Audible effortlessly weaves inspiration and entertainment into your daily routine. You can easily find the genres you love and discover new ones you like along the way. A title I cannot recommend enough is called The Road by Cormac McCarthy. It's about a father and son as they travel to safety after most of the world has been destroyed in this apocalyptic event. It's an incredible story of survival and hope. It's an amazing narrative. You gotta check it out. With Audible, there are endless audiobooks to choose from to fuel your imagination. There's more to imagine when you listen. Sign up for a free 30-day Audible trial and get your first audiobook for free. Just go to audible.com/Mrballen. Again, that's audible.com/Mrballen for a free 30-day trial. Okay, back to the stories. Around 5 p.m. on Sunday, August 15th, 1971, a 23-year-old man named Michael was sitting inside of his living room in rural Ontario, Canada. Michael was flipping through a photo album that showed pictures of him scuba diving and mountain biking and doing all these really high adrenaline activities because Michael really lived for adventure. And so as he's flipping through this album, he hears a knock on the door. So he stops what he's doing, he goes to the door, he opens it up, and there's this police officer who's totally frantic and is speaking a mile a minute, and he tells Michael, hey, so we had this guy who was swimming in a lake nearby, and he went missing. He's been gone for over an hour now. We don't know where he is, and we were asking around, does anybody have any scuba diving equipment or experience, because we need to get in there and look for this guy in the lake, and everybody said, you're the guy. You have scuba equipment, and maybe you might be able to lend it to us, so that, the police could go in there and look for this guy. Now, Michael was kind of caught off guard by all this. I mean, this was not a typical occurrence to have police show up and have this type of request, but Michael immediately felt this sense of responsibility. He did know that he was sort of the top dog in scuba diving in rural Ontario, Canada, and he's hearing this police officer say what he's saying, but he's thinking, even if I give you my equipment, you can't just put the stuff on and safely conduct dives. You need the training as much as you need the equipment. And so Michael just kind of instinctively said, hey, look, I'm not just gonna give you the equipment because I feel like I'm setting you up for failure here. What if I come with you, I'll put the equipment on, and I'll go look for this guy. I know what I'm doing, I know how to use the equipment, it'll be way safer and more efficient. And the cop said, thank you so much, that would be great, let's go. And so Kyle, he went and got his scuba equipment, and before long, he had thrown it in the police cruiser, and the two of them were flying towards the lake. About 30 minutes later, Michael and the police officer pull into this parking lot, this wooded lot with trees everywhere, and straight ahead of them, through the trees, they can see down below is this big lake. And then to the left of the lake is a big dam, and then beyond that, over to the left side of that, is a river. And so where the swimmer had gone missing was in the lake portion. And so Michael quickly hopped out of the car, he grabbed his scuba gear, and then he and the officer took off running through the trees down to the lake. And when they got down there, Michael scanned the area and he saw there were all these police officers and park employees. There were other people who clearly had just come to the lake that day, like tourists, and everybody's kind of scanning the lake. No one's really in the water, but everyone's sort of walking around the perimeters, like hoping they can just see this missing swimmer somewhere. And also Michael noticed clearly the family of this missing man was, off to the side, and many of them were crying. But it definitely seemed like no serious search effort had really happened yet. It's like everybody was just kind of waiting for something to happen. And so when Michael shows up with all his scuba gear, it was like everybody looked at him as like, oh my goodness, thank you. Like, get in there, find him. Like, I bet he's okay. Like, get out there. And Michael, he's thinking to himself that he hadn't done a search like this before, but the fact somebody was missing for that long already did not bode well. But he thought, you know what? I'm gonna go in there, I'm gonna give it my best shot, and I hope we find this guy still alive. And so Michael put on all his equipment right on the shore side, and everyone's waiting, kind of watching, anxious about what's gonna happen next. And once he had donned his equipment, Michael stood up and just began scanning the lake, looking for, any sign of where to begin the search, because it's just one man in this huge body of water. He needs sort of a starting point. And so it's quiet, everyone's just kind of watching Michael as Michael's looking around the lake. And then at some point, he looked out and he saw there was this little ripple, sort of right in the middle of the lake. Now, the surface of the lake had basically been glass-like because nobody was really in the water, save for like the very perimeter of the lake. And so the water was very calm. but he sees there's this little ripple sort of right in the middle. And so Michael points out the ripple to the other officer he was with and sort of anybody who could listen. And he said, okay, I'm gonna go in there and start searching right there. And so Michael goes into the water, kind of wades in till about his waist, and then he kind of looked around one more time, put on his mask, and went under the water. About 15 minutes later, the police officer who had originally gone and gotten Michael and driven with him to the lake, he was still just standing on the lake shore, along with the missing swimmer's family and other searchers, and pretty much everybody was just kind of waiting for Michael to give some sort of report about how the search was going. Now, Michael easily had enough air in his tanks to be out there for quite some time to do a pretty thorough search, and they're only 15 minutes in, so they don't really know if this is too early to expect feedback from Michael, but it's just tense. Everybody's just waiting, waiting to see what's going to happen. But at some point, as this officer is just standing there, one of the volunteer searchers comes bombing along the shore from up near the dam. They ran right down to this officer and said, hey, you got to come with me. We found something over there in the river. And so, at this point, the police officer is thinking, I bet they found the missing swimmer. They're probably not in this lake. Maybe they found them over in the river. And he's thinking the worst, right? So he runs with the searcher, he goes to the dam, he goes to the riverside on the other side of the dam, and there's this crowd of searchers and police that are all along the shore of the river. And so this police officer, he pushes through the crowd, expecting, frankly, at this point, to see a dead body, to see the missing swimmer. But when he parts the crowd and sees what they're all looking at, he realizes there has been a terrible mistake. So 2 hours earlier, when this missing swimmer first went missing, this is like before Michael was ever contacted, before he was out there searching for him. This is like the initial wave of panic that we have a person who is missing somewhere in this water. Well, a park employee had been really motivated to try to help with this search. And so without really telling anybody, they ran into the control room of the dam, and in there, they turned a valve. And this particular valve opened up a pipe that spanned from the lake back through to the river. And when this valve was turned and the pipe was opened up, water from the lake would go back into the river, basically draining the lake. This employee was thinking, if I drain the lake, it'll make it easier to search the lake where we believe this man has gone missing. Like, this will make it easier to search the lake. And so this pipe has been opened up, this 2-foot in diameter, 30-foot long pipe connecting river and lake. And it's sucking water like mad from the lake into that river. Nobody had really gone into the lake to look for this missing swimmer, believe it or not. So the lake really hadn't been touched as soon as this valve was turned. So the first person who went into the lake, once that was opened up, was Michael with his scuba gear on. And when he went into the water and actually flagged the ripple on the surface of the water, he didn't realize this, but that ripple represented this deadly undercurrent of all the water being sucked into this pipe. And so as soon as he went out and went under the water, the current pulled him so quickly and so hard that he couldn't resurface. All his equipment got yanked off his body and he was thrust into this pipe. And in the pipe, he got stuck. And he drowned inside of the pipe before eventually being forced out the other end, where his body spilled out onto the shore of the river. That's what everybody was crowded around once they got up to the riverside: Michael's dead body. 4 hours after Michael's body was found, they would find the missing swimmer. His body was located about 150 yards away from where Michael had first entered the lake. His body was found on the shore of the lake, and so Michael had sort of been close, but unfortunately that current had pulled him under and killed him. Today, the lake has been permanently drained, in part because of this tragedy. At 5 a.m. on June 28, 1988, a 25-year-old man named Jeffrey Link stood in the supply room of a small factory in Auburn, Indiana. He reached up and he grabbed a container on the shelf, and then with it in hand, he turned, left the supply room, and walked out into the main factory area. So the factory where Jeffrey worked was called Bastion Plating Company. And what they did is they made chrome-plated parts for cars. And Jeffrey's specific job was being a machine operator, which meant he basically kept a bunch of these machines running and periodically had to do maintenance on them. And in fact, today he was doing that. He was doing maintenance. Now, in general, this job that Jeffrey did was actually pretty dangerous. The machines they worked on were big industrial machines that often got really, really hot. In fact, it was not uncommon for Jeffrey and his colleagues to come home with burns on their body just from, touching these different machines. But It was just part of the job, and Jeffrey didn't mind it. The pay was pretty good, and overall, the thing he liked the most about his job was just the camaraderie, the other people that worked there. There was about maybe 36 employees who worked at this factory, and it was like a tight-knit family. And so it was like they struggled together. The job was kind of gritty and difficult, but it felt worth it. So on this particular day, Jeffrey walked along this walkway in the main factory area, and as he passed by his colleagues, he said hello. Again, everybody's friends here. And eventually, Jeffrey reached the machine that he was going to be performing maintenance on. And this machine was huge. And the only way for him to actually perform maintenance was to get inside of the machine. But, to Jeffrey and to his colleagues, this type of thing was completely routine. This is not a big deal. So, as soon as he got to the machine, Jeffrey, with this container he had gotten from the supply room, stepped inside. A few seconds later, one of Jeffrey's colleagues, who was standing on that same walkway Jeffrey had walked across to get to the machine he was working on, this guy hears a loud thud sound coming from over here, over where Jeffrey is. And he turns and he looks into the opening of this machine where Jeffrey had gone, and he sees what appears to be Jeffrey just lying on the ground inside of this machine. And this coworker is just not really understanding what he's seeing. He knows he just heard a thud sound and he's sort of putting it together. And as he's watching, another coworker runs into the machine where Jeffrey is. Clearly they've seen, Jeffrey fall, and so they go in to try to help him. And the guy on the walkway is watching, and this second coworker who rushes into the machine with Jeffrey just suddenly collapses as well, right next to Jeffrey. And then 2 more colleagues come running over, they go into the machine, and they too collapse. All 4 people are just down inside of this machine. And so the coworker who's out on this walkway can tell clearly there's something bad over there. I don't know what's going on. And so they turn, they run out of the factory, and they call 911. When they come back inside to see what's happening in here before first responders have arrived here, this is just seconds later, this coworker comes back to that walkway, and he sees now there's 20 other of his coworkers that have sort of begun congregating in this area near this machine. And they're all stumbling around, they're all disoriented, people are vomiting. It's like all hell had broken loose inside of this factory, and nobody knew why. And then the first responders become nauseated and disoriented, and they're completely down for the count. It's like nobody could be in this factory without losing their senses and collapsing. It would not be until later, when authorities were able to go into this factory with proper protective equipment on, that they could actually examine this machine that Jeffrey had been trying to do maintenance on. And also they examined the container that Jeffrey had brought with him into that machine. When they examined those 2 things, they figured out what happened. So the machine that Jeffrey was performing maintenance on, this big machine, was a huge metal tank that had recently been used to store a chemical called zinc cyanide. And so it was going to be Jeffrey's job to go inside of this tank, literally, and clean the inside of it. And so that container he brought with him from the supply room was a chemical cleaning solution. However, the factory had 2 distinct types of chemical cleaning solutions, and it was very important which one you used depending on what you were cleaning. Jeffrey knew that. He just accidentally grabbed the wrong one. And when this wrong chemical cleaning solution interacted with the residue of the zinc cyanide inside of that tank, it pretty much immediately created a cloud of poisonous hydrogen cyanide gas. This gas immediately caused Jeffrey to pass out, and then each of the subsequent coworkers who rushed into that enclosed space were hit with this gas as well. They too passed out. And as the gas continued to grow and spread, and as more people showed up to see what was going on, the gas began causing other people to pass out and get sick, all the way until, first responders were there. It was like the whole factory was filled with this poison. And so between the factory employees and all the first responders, in total, 39 people were hospitalized from this poisonous gas. And of those 39 people, 5 people died, including Jeffrey, the 3 people who rushed in immediately to try to help him and passed out next to him, as well as 1 additional coworker. In case you haven't heard yet, our newest graphic novel, Mrballen Presents Where Nightmares Live, is available for pre-order right now. It contains another 9 heart-stopping, strange, dark, and mysterious stories, all based on real events. This was a passion project. It took a lot of time, a lot of people involved, from the artwork to the storytelling. I mean, this is a beautiful piece to add to your collection, so you got to check it out. The book comes out on September 30th, but again, you can pre-order your copy at book.ballenstudios.com, or you can click the link in the description below. There are a limited number of hand-signed copies available, but those are going to sell out very quickly. So please pre-order today, because remember, your nightmares are waiting. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.